So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And welcome to this session on getting your work read, languages at the service of science. My name is Anne-Mette JENSEN-FOREMAN. I'm with the European Commission's department called the Joint Research Center. I lead a clear writing activity that we have there. We have heard already from some of the previous speakers how important translation is in Europe. We have many factors that unite us in Europe, geographically, culturally, and, as we heard, also in terms of democracy. But I'd argue that there's one other factor, perhaps a bit overlooked, even though it is crucial in binding Europe together, and that is translation. Because it is translation that allows us to exchange views, even with people whose languages we don't understand. It's translation that allows us to trade, to travel, and to enjoy literature from other languages. So it's really crucial in binding Europe together. Therefore, first of all, a warm thank you to all the translators in the room for this important role, as well as to my colleagues from DG Translation for having organized this Translating Europe Forum. Now, earlier today, we've already had sessions on consumer goods and on healthcare, climate change, and disaster management. But now we're moving on to the world of science, which, of course, touches upon all of these. As a scientist myself, I can venture that we often have quite particular mindsets and vocabulary / jargon. So it is a challenge to translate from scientific texts. Therefore, I'm delighted that we have with us today 3 pioneers, each of whom will share with us ways in which they have dealt with this particular challenge. And I might add, ways that can be emulated by others. So I hope you'll find these very inspiring. One will show how quite unorthodox partnerships can actually boost the quality of education in the field of translation. One will share tangible ideas for how universities successfully can cope with the ever-growing pressure always to publish science in English. And one will provide some personal insights, including how translators sometimes almost need psychic powers when they are dealing with scientists. Yes. You have the opportunity to ask questions via Slido. Just click on the Mansalt button if you do so. We'll try to address as many of those as possible, and there will also be the opportunity just to raise your hand and then speak in the microphone. So our first speaker today is Professor Sonia Vanderpitte from the University of Ghent. She's a professor, as you can see also in the brochure, from the Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication. And she's director of the Master of Translation program and head of the English section. She's got a dizzying publication record, and her current research involves eye-tracking research into reading and translation. But she's also investigating peer feedback and other collaborative forms. Sonia, I'd like to welcome you to the podium, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here as a speaker. How do I get my presentation on the screen? That's my first question.
Just here. Next.
Okay. My second question is the title of my presentation, How to Train Translation for Academic Purposes. And this is actually a question that I asked myself 3 years ago when I had to teach specialized translation within the scientific area for the first time. So what I'm actually going to show to you is how I organized my course a little bit, and how I designed training the translation for academia to my students, how I have been doing this for a couple of years. I actually wanted my students to help actually spread the ideas that are being built in academia, and since the title of this conference is The Added Value, then I think academia is known for building and also spreading new ideas, new knowledge, new information. Facts rather than fake news, that is, if the scientists stick to the ethics that they are supposed to work under. So what's the problem, actually, for the translation of science and academic purposes? Well, if you look at the literature, then there's quite a lot of information already available for translators on how to translate. And the main thing is actually that these texts contain highly specialized language. The technical vocabularies expand all the time, and so what the translators need to do is actually also very often invent new terms for the new concepts that are being built by these scientists. Some words, some texts also are so difficult, even texts from the past, that they need to be studied and retranslated because they're so hard. Think of Newton's Principia, for instance. So how am I going to train my students to do that type of translation? Now, since my students are not scientists, and the field that they are working in is the humanities, I thought, let me start with training my students to translate for the humanities in the first place, and then gradually go on and venture into the other fields. So what I did was look for some work on how to translate, how to train translators for the humanities. And I actually found one title, so I looked for the literature, I looked into the literature for a very long time, and there was this one chapter from a book on how to train translation, and it was Joshua Price's chapter in that book, Translating in the Human Sciences. And I thought, let me look at that and then I'll know how to do it. But then I found out that this was a course in translation studies. It was not a practical course for training students how to translate texts from the humanities. It was rather that all the students had to read texts from translation studies on how to think about terms like the Enlightenment, erklären, and this was all very interesting, of course, but it wouldn't help my students who want to learn how to translate texts that are being produced now in the humanities. So there's that kind of information, which didn't help me, so I had to devise and design my own course. So what I'm going to tell you is just two main things that I decided that my students needed to know, and then also what are some of the activities that I engaged them into. And then I'll summarize my principles. So, two things actually in my syllabus. They need to know something about specialized languages in the humanities and in the various sciences, and I also need to guide them to various resources for translating into Dutch then for my particular course. So what do I tell them? Well, I tell them that there are many different types of specialized languages in academia, because you have journal articles, you have books, monographs, there are also encyclopedia, there are handbooks, textbooks, primers, dictionaries, there are also syllabi, and there are also popular books, magazines, newspaper sections. So actually, there's something that you could see a gradient going from highly specialized language at the top here to more popular texts. And in terms of reader friendliness, that would of course be just the other way round, going from the most reader friendliness would be at the bottom of this range, while at the top you would find those that are less reader friendly, but not for the intended audience. But so from a lay perspective point of view, it's less reader friendly. So I give that to my students. I also give them a few resources, and one of the items that I would like just to point at very briefly now is that I also point at some of the regulations that there are, the norms, but also how to create, for instance, a search engine on Google, how they can actually customize a corpus very quickly into a subject if they don't know the subject yet. And this is the case, of course, with students, because they don't know anything about these subjects yet. So how can they find texts about a particular subject? I also give them some resources about the Dutch language, where they can find some of the register items, stylistic items. And here, one of the important things that they don't know yet about is the style guides that journals have, that publishers have, in connection with the publication of certain translated articles. So these are the things that I give to them as pieces of knowledge. So let me now talk about the activities that the students do. And I organize various types. I'll just talk very briefly here about 4 types. I want my students to do peer feedback for every translation that they actually engage in. I will also talk a little bit about the TAP collaboration. TAP stands for the Transatlantic Project and Pacific Project. So it's an international kind of collaborative exercise. I also had a guest lecture telling my students about how to translate for popular science. And then there's also a transcreation exercise. So very briefly, I'll just run through these, and you can ask me questions about them later on. Peer feedback in the class, I organize that in such a way that students always revise each other's work in 2 ways. First, there's one person looking at how adequate a translation is, so in terms of the source text, how is the same message given to the audience, in terms of the target audience, of course, that they should think of the target audience as well, but is the same core message delivered. And then the reviewing type of exercise, the second type, is the one where the students mainly look at the target text register, if that is what the type of language that the audience wants. I actually give 7 role types to my students, and I organize that for all of the students in my class beforehand. There's a schedule that they get. And here you can find the 7 role types, and some of them are combined. It depends on how large the groups are, but mainly, of course, besides the translator, the revision and the reviewing work, they also need to, after the reviewing work, there needs to be some editing done, and if several text passages are then put into one large text, then there's somebody who's the chief editor. And before all of the, before the translation actually starts, there's the corpus building and terminology management, so term extraction from the corpus. In connection with the TAP collaboration, I have had 2 experiences for this particular class. One was where my students actually contact technical writers from an American university, technical writers or scientific writers, learning how to communicate about technical communication. And in this way, they actually integrate this Q&A session in the translation process that David Jean-Yves this morning talked about. So it's this feed-forwarding type of role rather than getting feedback that I convey to these students. So the Flemish students translate the text, but they ask questions about the contents wherever they don't understand the content. In connection with my guest lecture, I had my students actually translate an article from the American Scientific for the popular magazine, scientific popular magazine EOS in Flanders, which translates all sorts of articles from the American Scientific Journal. And there are a few activities that I organize with them beforehand. And then on the day itself, the guest lecturer, he has actually read a few translations and he comments on the translations from my students and tells them how they can even improve what they already did. He was amazed by the quality my students had already produced, so his job was fairly easy, but there were differences in style, and so he mentioned those to my students. And then finally, there's a transcreation class. What do I do with them? Well, that ties in with the panel session from this morning, Translating for the Planet. I have my students read an article from the Journal of Applied Ecology. They're not ecologists at all, but they read it, they look up terms. I give them a lot of resources, and they actually create a short version about that particular text and also put the information within the Flemish context for the environmental organization Natuurpunt in Flanders. And the article is then actually produced and published in their magazine in the News and Trends section. I've got the activities there. This is a 5-class schedule, but you can organize it the way that you want to do it. So here you can see the product from last year, and this year my students are working on hedges and bats. Summarizing, there are these 3 main principles that I try to adhere to very strongly. It's the research mindedness, the creativity also for that, the interdisciplinarity, and then also, of course, the interpersonal features that they need to produce because of the collaboration in the class, but also abroad. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for showing how you are triangulating these different aspects in your university program. Our next speaker is Jean-Yves Le Disez, who's a lecturer at the University of the Western Brittany in Brest. That's in France, for those who don't know, where he teaches translation. And he has also authored several books, including one about the role of comprehension and a method of translating from English into French. He's a co-founder of the university's Writing and Translating Masters program, and what he'll be talking about today is the university's Translation Bureau. And I don't really want to steal your thunder, so I hand over to you now, Jean-Yves, and yes.
Well, hello everybody. So I'll tell you about this BTU, we'll call it BTU, it's easier for everybody. We'll look at some key figures, then I'll tell you what lessons we've learned in over 10 years now, and finally I'll say a word about the challenges ahead. So, of course, many universities have language departments which provide some sort of linguistic service, including sometimes translation and perhaps revision. But the crucial point here is that, as we shall see, is that our translation editing service is identified as such, officially recognized, and hence at once more visible and hopefully more professional. It started in 2010 when after the university published an appallingly poor translation of a brochure. So I was asked to produce a report and recommended the creation of an in-house translation service. I interviewed dozens of heads of departments and research centers and other administrative services and found what anyone probably would have found in 2010 in many universities, in many relatively small universities anyway, a lack of anything resembling a language policy, researchers writing papers and asking colleagues or language teachers and lecturers or sometimes just friends to revise and even translate them. Oh, hello, Jean-Yves, you're bilingual, so you can translate this for me, can't you? Ignorance, of course, about the translation process, let alone CAT tools and translation ethics. A translation bureau, I argued, could provide an answer to the needs already identified, increase the chances of papers written in English by our researchers to be published in international journals, encourage researchers who were not publishing because of the language barrier to do so, encourage the university to communicate better abroad, encourage staff mobility and student mobility. Right from the start, I insisted that the BTU needed to be not just a translation service, but a language service provider, which could provide a range of services, including revision, conference interpreting, liaison interpreting, transcription of recordings, localization of websites, and even, for example, a course on scientific writing. It should be accessible, that is, an in-house language service provider where potential users could come and discuss their needs with staff who have presumably a deep understanding of those needs and are both accessible, trustworthy, and friendly because they are colleagues. And also it should develop within the university an awareness of translation and scientific writing and language issues generally. That's the translation studies scholar in me. Sorry, I think I've got a bit confused. Yes, the translation, the BTU translates around 1 million words a year. It also manages about a dozen interpreting projects and translates for free, this is an important point, 200 diplomas each year. It is overseen by a scientific committee, which tells us what the needs of the university are, and also we are accountable to that scientific committee, and it has a turnover of about £170,000. It has two rates, an internal rate which is about 60% of the market rate, and an external rate, which is more or less the market rate. The shortfall due to the internal rate is compensated by a small subsidy by the university, which also pays for the translation of diplomas, which, as I said, is free for students. We have 3 in-house full-time translators and revivers, Catherine and Helen, who are English native speakers, and Sébastien, who is a French native speaker, plus myself, plus a network of some 30 freelance translators in France and abroad. Here we are. Let's look at some figures. The first chart shows the distribution between internal and external clients. The figures have changed over the years. As you can see now, the percentage of jobs done for others, about 20 different universities, has tended to increase. However, it has to be pointed out that 40% of today's turnover is more than 90% of our original turnover. So, in fact, our internal activity has created. When we started this, someone told me, you will see, supply will create demand, and it has. This is an extremely important point. If we now look at the distribution between the various types of services offered by the BTU, we have this. As can be seen, translation is our main activity. Interpretation accounts for only 4% of what we do, in part because we provide that service only for relatively small conferences where no more than 60 people or so need interpretation. Revision accounts for almost 40% of our activity and is very much on the increase. Let's now see who needs translation and who needs revision. Clearly, scientists in France tend to write in English, with many needing someone to improve their papers, to increase their chances of being published, while in the humanities, few people write in English, even though they wish to present a paper in English at a conference or publish in English, and that, of course, is even more true of the administrative services. As far as the distribution by language is concerned, we don't need a chart. The English-French language pair accounts for almost 95% of our workload, but we do translate from and into other languages, resulting in that case on external translators. Well, what have we learned in all those years? Well, I think we have achieved what we set out to do, basically, and because we translate or edit on a regular basis for many other universities, the BTU also has contributed, I think, to the reputation of our university. An in-house service of this kind has many advantages in its own right. It encourages cooperation in the sense that Anthony Pym gave to the word. We at the BTU see ourselves as a service which provides solutions, which listens to clients' needs, and which suggests solutions in their, not our, interest. Cooperation also means trust, easy access, friendliness, simplified administration. We're often invited by research centers to speak in their meetings. This enables us to reinforce existing links, raise our profile, keep everybody updated. Recently, we've received texts obviously translated with the help of DeepL. Rather than blame the clients, we, on the contrary, encourage them to be transparent about it, and we are currently discussing a new service for the post-editing of DeepL texts. This would involve an even more collaborative relationship with the client at a rate lower than that for translation. The existence of the BTU also means research centers increasingly anticipate expenses and include translation and revision costs in their budgets, and many people in the university have become far more aware of translation issues. So, the BTU doesn't want to grow bigger. we are helping the University of Nantes to develop its own BTU. We are now in a sort of intermediary stage where they are becoming more and more autonomous. But we still have a number of challenges facing us. We must make sure, of course, we continue to have the support of our community. I like Andrew Chesterman's concept of striving for excellence. We must also make sure our translators remain motivated and willing to continue to improve their skills, which means more time for training and exchanging with other actors in the industry, such as in the Translating Europe workshop we organized with INIST, the other public service translation in the French academic world. We do use CAT tools, but we lack time and resources to optimize them. Something like a glossary of everything academic would certainly, a kind of BTU lingui would be wonderful. We must keep defending and strengthening our added value, an expression that has often been heard this morning. And finally, while encouraging cooperation with others, we must make sure we remain true to the spirit of our beginnings, which has enabled us to be what we are today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Yves. I think you have demonstrated fully how you are adding value galore. So that's wonderful to see. And I think maybe you were a bit modest, but I certainly took note that you're practically self-financed too, which I think is just amazing considering the service you're offering. We're moving on to our last speaker now, and I'm looking at you, Sarah, and I know you're going to take it from the podium, so please, the floor is yours. Actually, I rudely forgot to introduce you, Sarah. Sarah is a freelance editor and translator, and she also has a half-time post, a senior lecturer at the Translation Studies at the University of Portsmouth. Some of her activities include translating for the bilingual medical journal Actas Dermosophiliographica's, if I'm pronouncing it right, but also UNICEF, NGOs, and other international organizations. So, all yours, Sarah.
I've pressed something, it works, that's good. Okay, so I'm here today in one of my hats as a freelance translator and editor. I have to say that in the latter years I've moved much more to the editing, and you'll see why as I go through this. So it's very much a personal view of things I've done. I have a shorter attention span, a low boredom threshold, so I tend to move from one thing to another quite quickly. The best client and the best job I ever had, I can pretty firmly say that, was working with a team on Actas Dermosophiliographica's, which is a bilingual dermatology journal produced in its entirety from letters to the editor to very sort of high-level research articles in English and Spanish. And the wonderful thing about it was we were a team which included people like me, entry-level, not particularly scientific translators, all the way to surgeons and life scientists who would edit us. And it was absolutely brilliant because everything went through 3 rounds of feedback. We shared our translation memories, we shared our resources, we shared corpora, and it was a dream experience. And the reason that this group, this professional entity of dermatologists did this was because they wanted to get the citations they needed for their career development. And to do that, it had to be in English because that's how it works. Okay. Another good client that I worked for, it was an EU entity. And again, the brilliant thing as a freelance editor working alone in my home was that there was about 10 of us who worked on these texts. Most of what we were doing was style editing of expert writers who were non-natives, who were more or less receptive to the changes we made. So we learnt very quickly how to humbly say, well, you obviously know what you're talking about, but actually quite often it's better to phrase it this way. And you learn to be a bit more diplomatic doing this. So this was brilliant. And in theory, there was no content editing, but actually quite often you'd find that there was more than you'd anticipated. But it was really nicely well paid because it was related to EU entities, so you could take a little bit of extra time. Another thing I do, and I still do quite regularly, is I do pro bono translating for the Author Aid in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is basically through the dermatology editing. I met a lot of medical editors, medical writers, medical translators, and one of them had worked in Shiraz, and she was actively helping people there to get published, because it's very hard when you are peripheral, marginalized language community and you're having to publish in English to get this sort of help. So again here, as a non-scientist, this was great because the English was the only issue here. So it was wonderful. Quite often you had to negotiate between the writers and the demands of the target journal, because I don't know how many of you have done any sort of translating or editing for journals, but every single journal has completely different demands upon you. And if you are a foreign language speaker and you have to negotiate that as well as getting your work into English, that can be the barrier to publication. So we do quite a lot of work on going back to people and saying, look, you need to do it this way, your references need to be in this format, basic things like that, or you need an abstract in some cases. Yeah. Okay, I'm a freelancer. Quite often there's a little bit of empty space. People come along randomly and they will ask me to do things. And very often there's a great misunderstanding of what it is that I'm actually doing. The amount of times that my university inbox fills up with things where people want me to find a student to translate this. And another of my roles, which I don't think was mentioned, until May, I was chair of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, which is a professional association for translators and interpreters in the UK. And one of the issues, one of the reasons for that entity existing is the professionalisation of our sector. And these people are approaching me and saying, get a student to do it. It really doesn't matter. And it does. What they want is a perfect outcome, but that's the way they approach it. I've been approached by people who are students who would like me just to sort of mend this. This is my thesis. And that if their supervisor has said to them, you need to get help, there's serious problems, okay? And these things, the deadlines, the lack of money, etc., etc. And then the last one was a text. I thought, great, it's a book. It's this many pages long. This is a whole summer's work, and then I can take a month off. I can go traveling. I read the book, and it's not a medical text. It's a new age idea of, the child, the fetus, was originally an angel, because you can see where the shoulder blades are, that's where the wings were once attached, and your dreams just sort of melt away into nothing. It's all gone. Okay. Normally what the random clients want is this. Okay, they don't want you to ask anything. They want it now. You are the tail end of the production process, and it needs to be now. So we've got a lot of education to do there. And we can't, as freelance translators, running our own businesses at the end of the chain, we don't have the welly to do that, which is where professional associations come in. Because this is what the client is often asking for, although they don't know what they're asking for. And this is a chart made by a couple of colleagues of mine from Brian Mossop's Editing and Revising for Translators. And they've adapted it by adding on the end what translators do. I get paid most for author editing of non-native speakers. That's my best income stream, and it is the least work. Okay. When I'm translating, I am wrestling it out of often a not particularly good version of the source language into, obviously my drafts are not particularly good either, but then I am editing it, and quite often I am restructuring and I am changing the content because I am aware of the target reader's needs not being what they will be provided by a straight translation. So, I don't know where to indicate because there's so many screens, but over on the left-hand side, you've got the really heavy work of the translator who edits it all with the closest readers, the most careful revisers. And then, over on the other end, you've got the various sorts of editing, and clients don't know what they're asking for. You get the, can you proofread this? No, they don't want you to proofread it. They want you to completely review, revise the translation, mend it, and make it perfect. So we can use this to as leverage, depending which side of the ocean you're on. Okay. Yes, instructions for authors. This is a big thing to negotiate when you're doing translation and editing. Some journals have these and don't really care about them. Some journals have these and they are basically what are going to stop you being published because they've got so many submissions, anything is an excuse to bin your manuscript. A good editor needs to know their area and needs to know which ones have to be observed, which don't, and to advise accordingly. Style guides are great, and as, again, freelancers, we need to be aware of the fact that these are guides, but we need to be aware of what's essential and what's not essential. And throughout my career, I started working in a press agency in the 1990s, and we had The Economist and the Chicago Style Guide were our Bibles. On Actas Dermo, the American Medical Association massive, big, fat style guide was our guideline. And that actually, as a humanities person, I was like, oh dear, it's all going to be about the numbers and funny words and all this sort of thing. But it's brilliant. It's applicable very much to writing for a general audience as well. And yeah, the Chicago is the big mama. Whenever anybody doesn't know what to do, they say, look at the Chicago Style Guide. Okay. As a freelance, you have to be technically competent. This story of freelance translators and editors being Luddites is just not today's story at all. Everybody I know who is successful knows how to use all the Microsoft array of tools adequately. They often use more than one CAT tool, perfect it as an editing tool to make sure that the style sheet is as you want it, bibliography tools, and all sorts of other researching and corpora style tools. So we, in our professional associations, try to help our members to keep up with this because we're at this knee of the curve of developments at the moment, and it's just so rapid, the change, that you can't do it on your own. You need to be with other people. And that's the references. So I think I came in under time. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I would like to ask now, Margit, if we have received any interesting questions on the Slido, and maybe you could read those aloud.
I'm afraid.
I don't think your microphone is on. No.
No? Yeah. So, BTU, very inspiring story. You're a shining example for others to follow. Then we had some questions. Should scientists avoid publishing in English given their unfortunately too poor level of language mastery? So that's the main question. But we also had the revised version. Instead of teaching translators about the specialized language of science in academia, why not teach scientists how to translate? And maybe one other pick. So I would also advise you to grab our speakers during the networking drink to further the discussion a bit. There's a question of how to build a corpus. But maybe that one I would give to the panel. Editor, reviewer, reviser. How does one make a distinction between those roles?
Maybe we stop here and let the panelists answer here. Maybe Jean-Yves, you'd like to start, and then I think we go to you for that second.
No, I don't remember the questions either, but I'm very talkative, so I'll manage. Why not teach scientists how to translate? Because it's not their job, because it's a specific skill. But you can't teach them how to translate, but you can certainly teach them how to improve their papers in English, if they're writing in English. Or perhaps you could also, if they're writing in French and you're working with them on a regular basis, you can perhaps encourage them to signal aspects of the text that are particularly important, build this cooperation, perhaps also try to think in terms of, of globalization, of internationalization, that is perhaps reduce some cultural or language specific items, that sort of thing. But otherwise, no, I think precisely that's what we defend, the idea that translators and revivers have specific skills. They must also know, as we saw this morning, about the fields in which they're translating and revising, but precisely they have that specific skill. And that is what we're selling.
If I may jump in here, I didn't go into too much detail about the initiative we have at the Joint Research Centre. Is your mic still on? No. Okay. But it actually is to help our scientists bridge the gap between science and non-scientists. So how can we communicate science to policymakers and journalists and stakeholders and citizens? So obviously it's not translation between different languages, but it is translation in inverted commas from the scientific jargon, technical language to something other people can understand. So I actually like the idea, and I'm living it right now, but it was just a little side remark. Does anybody else from the panel have any comments to what has already been said, or shall we move on to?
So then there was, how do you prepare your students for the totally different agency, the transparency of the translator in the corporate world where they might end up? So that's maybe also a discussion for the evening. That comes down to the basics. Do universities provide funding to get their academics' papers translated? They are under pressure to publish in English, but have to rely on friends to do that. That's the obvious issue.
Well, that's the whole point. We managed to convince the university that it was in its interest to invest in translation. Actually, in 10 years, the number of publications by the University of Brest, especially in our field of excellence, marine science, where we are number 4 in Europe and number 12 in the world, the number of papers has increased dramatically. So, yes, it's worth it. It depends. It doesn't cost all that much. Much money is spent on less useful things in universities. I would certainly encourage any university which wants to help its research to invest in translation and revision, and because quality is essential. If your paper it doesn't follow the standards you mentioned, you have simply no chance of being published.
I would like to ask you a question too, Jean-Yves, because you mentioned you also do editing. And ethically, where is the limit? I mean, if somebody brings their thesis along, or their draft thesis, I should say, how involved can you become? Would you like to comment on that, please?
Well, in the case of a PhD, for example, that had not been defended, we wouldn't meddle with it, of course, because it would be unethical. But in the case of colleagues who are publishing, we are there to help them. So if it means revising, we revise. But there comes a stage where we say, look, what you're asking is it's exactly what you said. What you're asking us to do is actually to rewrite your text. So you cannot get this for the price of revision, you're going to have to give us the French version if you have it, or we're going to charge for a job that is not what you think it is.
Yeah. I see. I'm supposed to end now. We can't do one. Okay, I'm really sorry about that. Can you ask it bilaterally, maybe? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, and thank you to the speakers for their participation.
I'm sorry that I had to cut off the discussion a bit, but we have to go up again to the next session.